Hello and welcome to Aether and Ink. I'm Penelope Hartley, and this is a storytelling podcast where we explore the creative arts, both literary and mystical. Joining me today is special guest Pat Olney, author of Fire Horse. Hello, Pat.
How are you doing, Penelope?
I'm great. How are you doing, Pat?
Great. Thanks for having me on your podcast.
Well, thanks for coming. So tell everybody that's watching at home or wherever they're watching from a little bit about yourself.
Sure. I come from the world of meeting agendas and boardrooms. So I was a business executive for 3 decades, recently retired, and was able to finally start pursuing my passion, which is creative writing. And I've really enjoyed connecting with this online community.
Yeah. So how long have you been writing creatively?
Well, I wrote, self-published my first novel, Fire Horse, this past June, but I wrote it in the fall of 1990. And I think, as you well know, with the writing process, it sort of sits there and then you decide to dust it off. And I finally had it professionally edited and a voice recording done as well, an audiobook. And I'm working on my second novel and a collection of short stories now as well. So much more active.
Bug. You got bit by the bug. I think that a lot of times, I remember being a new writer writing poetry and not having the experiences that I have now has given me, I didn't have as much to write about except a very small universe when I was growing up. And I think that looking back over the course of my life, it gives you a lot more to write about after you have a lifetime of experiences. So I think that, I think that it's a lot of writers do tend to start a little bit later after they have something, important to write about or interesting to write about or can reflect on their lives.
Right.
So, yeah. Sorry, I just.
Anyway, I'm here to interview you, and I think this podcast is not only for those that are joining today, but it's going to be for future fans of Penelope Hartley. So I think it's good if you're okay with it, if we spend a little time getting to know you better.
Okay. Yes, I love that subject. Me.
So maybe. Why don't we start with the basics, sort of what I call the name, rank, serial number, where you were born and grew up and when you took an interest in writing and poetry, which I know is a core strength for you.
So I was born in a tornado, I think, in the middle of the Midwest and dropped here at a very young age. I was born and raised in Kansas. And I lived here most of my life. I've traveled a bit out of the state, which has given me a very interesting worldview. Has definitely added to my the expansion of my experiences as well as books. And so I wasn't able to travel when I was younger, so I read a lot. And some of my first significant favorite book was probably A Wrinkle in Time by Madeleine L'Engle, which is a sci fantasy novel about 3 kids looking for their father who has been kidnapped and taken into a different dimension. And so that definitely had an impact on my formative years. The second book that I read that I have to say has been a lifelong favorite from childhood was Watership Down.
Love it.
Richard Adams. Yeah. And if you don't know the story, it's about rabbits. It's about hares living on the moors. It takes place in England, and it's about their society. And it starts out with an adventure, and they have the psychic rabbit Fiver, and they have the leader Hazel. And Fiver has a vision that something terrible is going to happen, and nobody believes him except for his brother Hazel. So they decide to embark on an adventure. They take as many rabbits as they can, and it's about them exploring the world and finding their own place to call home. So that was those 2 books probably very much marked my early experiences with reading and what would come to be me as a writer. Later on, it would be things like Kurt Vonnegut, who I read Cat's Cradle.
Mm-hmm.
Absolutely adored that book. Could not, if you ask me what happened in that book right now, tell you anything except the feet thing at the end, because I haven't read it in a really long time. I just remember being very taken by the elegance of his like almost surrealist style. Like I really loved the way that he would take these very strange ideas and tie them into each other. And later works like Jitterbug Perfume. I can't remember the author's name right now, but the same kind of postmodernist literature I really enjoyed. So, but when I was younger, I was also not only a reader, but I think a lot of us went through the angst and poetry phase when we were younger. I didn't give up on it. Through my life, I've always written poetry, and I've always had sort of an artistic appreciation of language, and I sometimes think of myself as using it like a palette of colors. There's symbols that I get to arrange in different ways that sound good or that have specific meanings that I want to convey, or they're just very atmospheric or that crash together on the page. Like you can do a lot with language evocatively just by putting little black marks on paper. It's wonderful.
Absolutely. And I have here, we've spoken, I've read your work, and I really enjoyed Datura's greatly. And you mentioned to me when we talked about it once that for you it was an effort in combining poetry and prose. And so maybe that's something you could talk a little bit about, how you like to bring poetry to it.
I call myself a classically trained poet. I have most of a master's degree in creative writing in poetry. I'm not actually, fiction writing wasn't my fort. But what I did before I got the creative writing degree was history. So academic essays were something that I did an awful lot of, because history is the history of the written word. So you got to write words to do the history. And I did a lot of the word writing for the history. So I really enjoyed, actually, I would have preferred when I went back to school for an English degree to do creative nonfiction, because I thought that was a combination of like some of the more artistic elements of language, but also talking about, nonfiction, which I was very familiar with. They didn't offer that. They offered fiction and poetry. And I was like, well, I'm more accustomed to poetry than I am to fiction. So I went for I almost made it to the end and studied poetry and wrote a lot of poetry. I had reams of poetry when I was done with that. When I was done with that degree, not that I finished it, but I was over it. And so I did some traveling, did some other things, decided to settle down, and eventually got the inspiration to be a writer of fiction stories, which is strange for somebody who writes poetry, because poetry is very economical in terms of the words. You have one page to express something that transcends experience. You have a whole book to do that when you're writing fiction or a short story or whatever. So it was very a little discombobulating to me, writing very dense passages with this very correct word choice and trying to stretch that out into like 50, 60, 70, 1,000 words. My novels tend to be very short because I just have the background for writing very succinctly. But also, I think using language in a very, in a very poetic way. So there is a strange balance with writing with a poetry background or writing lyrically, and not making it too dense, but also not making it too cavalier. Maybe is the right word. I mean, because
you want it to be accessible for your reader, but you also want to dumb it down, right? And so, some of your fans and audience may be aspiring writers themselves. In fact, I know some are. What advice would you have for those who don't have a formal education in language and poetry? Is it something worth pursuing, or are there other life hacks for trying to arm oneself with those tools?
Absolutely. First and foremost, read. Whatever you're reading is going to teach you on some subliminal or not so subliminal level how to write. I remember a story about Hunter S. Thompson, the gonzo journalist of the 70s, 80s, and 90s, who once sat down to write one of Hemingway's books, typed out his book on a typewriter, because he wanted to know what it felt like to write such a beautiful piece of work. I think he said a bestseller, but I'm not sure if that's the word he used, but he wanted to experience that for himself. So writers always have, I believe, good writers always have some sort of background in reading. Quentin Tarantino said something that I really like about filmmaking. He's like, if you like movies, you'll probably make a good one. So if you like books, you'll probably write a good one. You can learn a lot of technique from reading. One of the things that I did when I was working on my degree was reading poetry and reading about craft and how poets and other authors wrote poetry. So a lot of my background and a lot of my degree work came from studying how not only other poets, but also how they created their poetry, which I found phenomenally informative. I think that one of my favorite things that I have read about craft is something William Faulkner said. He said the ideal writing environment is to be an owner of a brothel, because you can write all day and nobody bothers you, and you can be left alone to do your craft. Like, he's like, but his point, of course, he was being cheeky, but his point was that finding the correct environment to write is essential for writing. And I think that you can take that advice wherever you are, whoever you are, and give your writing ritual and intention. Like, I need an hour to myself every day. So it is not impossible. In fact, it is very likely that if you want to be a writer, you will. I would pursue reading first. I would read the kind of stories that you want to tell, but I would just also, like, for me, it wasn't about like setting out with an intention to write a particular story. It was setting out with a love of all different kinds of storytelling and trying to combine it in such a way that made some sort of coherent story. With Love Spell Murders, more so. With Datura's Requiem, I had a very distinct strategy for that.
Well, we'll come back to your genre blending and busting if we get a chance to talk about Love Spell, and I'm sure we will. If you're okay, I'd actually like to read a bit of poetic prose that caught me right away with Datura's, since we're on the subject of how poetry informs your writing.
Sure.
So this is the preface to the book. And afterwards, I'm going to ask you to talk with the audience a little bit about what it means to you and where it comes from. I know fate is written in the night sky. The drop of a tarot card is as real as a handshake or a heart attack. I've seen dreams turn into glimpses of what's yet to come. Healing is magic, and so is hope. You don't have to believe these things, but if you listen very, very closely, the stars glittering in the dark have a story to tell. Do you know what their favorite thing to talk about is? How wonderful you are. So, about that piece.
That's spelled out. Because it's my first book, it's my debut novel. And I wanted to say something to the reader before I took them on this very dark journey into very strange territory about not only about the story, not even about the story, but about themselves and how I saw them and how I see myself. And so a lot of what I deal with is a very spiritual, mystical, occult. I have a very strong attraction to the occult and spirituality and contrasts and contradiction in all their emanations. So I very much appreciate that readers that approach my work could be very cynical or even skeptical of it. And I didn't want them to let that deter them from reading the story and still enjoying it on some level. But that being said, I wanted to I wanted to stand behind my own spirituality and my own beliefs. So I figured, what better way to do that than to preface every book I ever read since by saying, this is what I believe in. And it's okay not to believe that way. We all have different ways that we've approached life and taught about life, how we navigate life. And all of those are okay. But I've heard things, and I've seen things, wonderful things, crazy things, terrifying things that seem like a very strange glimpse into something that is a part of reality, a part of existence, not even a part of the whole, maybe. And something that is very difficult to translate into words. But one of the messages that always comes through the strongest for me is, and that's what I really wanted to do, was share that message with people. You don't have to believe what I've seen. You don't have to believe the glimpses I've had behind the veil. But what I wanted to tell you is that beyond that exists a very powerful love. And that and beauty, and that transcendentalness, that's what art is for me, is reaching beyond that to touch something not ephemeral. Beauty is ephemeral. That an ephemeral quality that allows us to see something greater than ourselves. Love is the quality, I think. And I just wanted people to know that I've experienced love in an almost like pure form. And I wanted to know that, I just wanted them to know that it was out there for everybody. Now, let's go dive into the shadow work with Datura's Requiem. Bring a flashlight.
I think you've done a nice job, because I come from the world of skepticism and facts and science, and I can read a book like this, and because you're subtle enough with those views, you put them in, but you still leave. I mean, you write the story in such a way that it's, I would say, very accessible for those who might be skeptical of any of those views. You put them in there, as you said, but you don't hit them with a sledgehammer. You're very nuanced in your approach. And in fact, the work felt very, very personal. Can you say a little bit about the inspiration for the actual story in Datura's, and how long it's been with you in some form or another, and finally what compelled you to put it down on paper?
So the story, I think, itself was part of the architecture of my museum of artifacts. The representations that get codified in experiences, and not the happy, bright, sunshiny parts of my experiences, but the stuff that you want to stuff in the basement and not go visit too often. A lot of experiences that I've had with toxic relationships, which is a majority of what the book is about, but also generational trauma as well. So I think that we all have a shadow, and we all have things that we've hidden in the shadow, and we all have things that we're guilty about, or we've been made to feel guilty about. And for me, that was something lingering in a way that would not allow me to necessarily, I think it was holding me back. I think a lot of it was holding me back in terms of self-confidence, maybe, or the way that I presented myself, my assertiveness, definitely. And a lot of that had to do with the kind of guy that I was attracted to, who seemed to be casually interested in me. And I was a poet, so I was immediately in love with them. Was I? Well, that's a different story. But casually interested, but never quite showed up for the relationship, or quite showed up for me. So I had this kind of nostalgia for growing up in the 80s and with fantasy and with heroes, wondering where the fuck he was. Where is the white knight in my life? And these guys would keep showing up, and they'd kind of look like him, but they never really turned out to be him. And I think that it gave me sort of a broken heart condition, where that I was very haunted by these relationships and this emptiness that they left for me. And so then I decided to, and it culminated in an event about 7 or 8 years ago, where I left a very terrible relationship under very chaotic circumstances. And even after the guy was gone, I felt very brokenhearted about his absence. Even though I knew I should respect myself, I didn't. And that kind of stayed there and didn't really progress too much. So, but then I decided to sit down and be a writer. And I wrote a sci fantasy story, which I won't talk about here because it tends to belong to the larger arc. And then I went back and I tried to write something else, and that wasn't quite right. And then I ended up writing a story that happened in between those two. And that took 2.5 years to write, but it was the first book I wrote, and it was learning how to be a writer for me. That process of learning how to be a writer with the Horse Thief's grimoire. And then I realized at that point, that's when I had an idea of like, okay, this is what it's going to take for me to be a writer. I actually have to write things. And I ended up writing the Love Spell Murders. And after I got done with the draft of that, I had this very strong impulse to write a book that incorporated all of the poetry that I had written in college. So one of the things that connects these two, the relationship that I had gotten out of that was very traumatic, had me in a very deep depression. I have struggled with depression and anxiety my whole life. And I was very, very distraught. And the universe is looking out for us. I so believe that, because I had this random conversation with an English professor who told me if I went back to school to get my English degree, that I would be hired on as a professor at this community college. And I was like, okay, well, that's a direction to go in. So I got enrolled in what I probably should have been doing at 19, which was like writing, learning how to write. But anyway, so I took the scenic route, whatever. But that experience kept me so busy that I couldn't be distracted or upset about the relationship that I had before, even though I was trying to process it through some poetry and writing poetry, which was very dark. But I got really good at writing poetry. Like, I actually remember reading one of my poems a year ago and being like, who wrote this? This is really, I wrote this? Oh my God.
Do you feel that you need to experience some suffering like that to really and to be willing to be honest and transparent about it to really achieve when you're writing poetry?
I think that that you have to experience. So I think that a lot of let me see. I think that as human beings, we desire to experience as much of the spectrum of human experiences as we can. And I think that for people like me who have had traumatic life experiences in the past, I don't think it's necessary, because I think there's some wonderful people out there writing really wonderful poetry that has nothing to do with sadness. But I think that and this is probably one of my closer to my core beliefs, is an idea that the beginning of Wish You Were Here, I think, by Pink Floyd, starts out as a very grainy, can't quite hear it guitar.
Yeah.
And then it comes in very clear, and you can see how melodious and beautiful it is. And I think it's that contrast that attracts me. I always come back to this in my art and my writing. The contrast. It's difficult to see. There's a line from the Love Spell Murders that I'll use to illustrate this point, and it is, what good is the light if there's no shadow to define it?
Yep.
And it's that tension, that contrast between two opposites and bouncing between those two things that I think makes enchanting or compelling or evocative storytelling. Don't think that you necessarily, I would not recommend having the life I had. I would not. Depression is a beast, and it's difficult to get rid of. And anybody who's had any sort of mental health experiences like that may be able to find some relief through writing. I didn't actually intend to be a cathartic poet when I was in college for it. Like, I wasn't writing to alleviate the pain, I was writing to describe it. But later on, after I'd written the first draft of the Love Spell Murders, I got this impulse to go back and revisit that poetry and create something from it that would meld poetry and storytelling together. Nice. But I also got a very strong idea that it would help mend my broken heart. And so I felt I never actually intended to sit down and write something and sort of vomit it out on the page or like detoxify myself by turning it into art. That's never been part of my process, but this felt like that was the intention with it, catharsis. And in a way, such in a storytelling style that anybody who had experienced something like it may be able to get some sort of some grounding from their experience by having sometimes it's just really great to know that you're not alone in the way that you feel about things.
Yeah.
And I know that there's a lot of people who've experienced toxic relationships. And I think that we've all been very lonely in relationships. Some of us have, maybe not all of us, but I think that part of that, there's an anger that comes with that for being stood up in your relationships. So when I decided to write the story, the healing came in, not from the writing of the story, but from taking the perspective of not the innocent child or the innocent woman or the distraught princess, but from taking it of the perspective of the reluctant white knight and examining as honestly as I could through his eyes why the hell he never showed up. And that's where I really got the inspiration for sitting down to write specifically Datura's Requiem. I also ran into that picture. I was going through as a historian, I go through my archives from time to time to see what's in there. And I found that picture. And I was like, oh, it's a beautiful picture. Maybe I can somehow combine. A lot of what I do is very synchronic.
Oh, sorry for your audience. That picture, I'm assuming that you're referring to is this picture here of the Datura.
That is, yes. They do grow around here. I felt terrible because this summer
and they're toxic. Don't eat them, folks.
Yeah, I found out later after I wrote that story that there was actually like a 90s thing where people had some interesting things happen to them. And I didn't even know there's almost like a cult-like presence around it that I had no idea about. So a lot of my work is, like I say that like a very mystical, spiritual, blah, 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 but uncanny coincidences is my jam. So like if things start occurring in pairs or in threes, I know that they want to be combined into whatever I'm working on. So the image of the Datura meeting Jared Kaufman, who is from San Francisco, by the way, and having this impulse to write the story that will help me mend a broken heart are all kind of the genesis of this story.
Oh, and so I think it's really interesting that, and again, I'm thinking of aspiring authors out there as well as your future fans, but you were able to do a couple of things. I mean, take something such a deeply personal story and still make it cathartic for yourself and still make it relatable for a regular reader like myself, which I thought was really takes some technique. And the other thing was taking the perspective of Sebastian, who is the reluctant white knight you described. How difficult was it to write the male perspective for you?
Not very. I don't know how to say this. Like I've been at chicken dude places. Like I was a historian, which was predominantly men. And I have, if you ask my astrologer, I have a hell of a lot of Mars in my chart. So there is an aspect of myself, even as a youngster. I might not have always, I might have been seen as a woman. And there were certain expectations tied to that in regards to my assertiveness. But I grew up not only loving like, A Wrinkle in Time, but I loved adventure stories. I always loved adventure stories. And later on, I would read the books of Clive Cussler. And I never saw a distinction between myself and the male lead. I always thought I could be that adventurer. I was like, I wanted to be the guy who was running around the Incan crumbling societies and looking for treasure. Like that sounded so appealing to me. When I was young, I wanted to be like a fire warden in the forest. Like I had very masculine traits. that I really sort of entertained. I wanted to be Indiana Jones. I'll just be honest. I mean, that's kind of where the history thing comes in later, but I really wanted to just be Indiana Jones when I was
Yeah,
a
we
kid.
all did in the 80s.
Right. Right. Like he was amazing. Right. And I just never thought like that my gender should prohibit me from doing that. There's other things that prohibit me from doing that, but not my gender. But so I felt like I've just had a lot of I read a lot of books about men that, and I love men who write. Like I love Hunter S. Thompson. I love oh yeah, oh, there's a bunch. Well, yeah, Kurt Vonnegut and things like that. So for me, there's always been like, there's never been a distinction between a feminine and a masculine voice necessarily. I think that socially there definitely is, but I think that stripping that away and kind of telling the story, all I had to do really was write Sebastian impulsively about what I would do. And the first time that really came up was his encounter with his director in the
Cameron.
Cameron St. James, which is a hot little thing that happened. But also like I wrote him just very much from the perspective of somebody who was a little entitled, felt a little special because he just won an Oscar. So, you know, he has this sense of like entitlement and fame thrust upon him, but he has a very there's a very dark part of him that he hasn't resolved yet. And also like I think that there is definitely it can definitely be not discombobulating, but also like you see people who get famous very quickly having a lot of problems because they're just simply not ready for the attention.
When he was young, when he became famous, like 17, if I remember right,
17, yeah.
and impressionable, and it was unexpectedly thrust upon him, like so many other things. And I wonder, since we're talking about Sebastian, if it wouldn't be a good time for me to introduce your fans to him with a short excerpt from Daturas.
Yeah, absolutely.
So this is actually from the first chapter of the book, captures your interest right away. Sebastian, winter 1990. To be or not to be, that is the question. Hamlet, Act 3, Scene 1. I glanced to my right. The pines and aspens beside the road were a furious brown patchwork, blurred into a mess of dying color. They hid the outline of the mountains rising to meet heaven in the breaking light. The tires screeched. Was I racing to meet heaven? Was she? A scream tore through me, the anguish ripping itself out of my throat as I gripped the wheel. All the violence I'd seen, everything I'd done, clawed at my insides. The Chevy skidded around a hairpin turn, the screech of rubber barely keeping me from smashing into the wall of rock towering on my right. I jerked the wheel, straightening it out as I barreled down the empty highway. On my left, just beyond the flimsy steel barrier, a 40-foot drop into a valley of shadows waited for me. I knew I should slow down. I glanced in the rearview mirror. My hair was matted with sweat against my forehead, mixing with the tears streaming down my face. My flesh was raw and bleeding from where I'd clawed at my eyes, but it didn't do any good. Another vision flashed before me. I saw her through him, through the contagion. His hand was still wrapped around her throat. She was breathing again. I could feel her soft skin pressed beneath my palm, the frantic pulse of her terror beating against me. I could hear the hitch in her breath as she struggled, powerless. Her tender neck, her racing heartbeat. Could nothing end this tragedy? I slammed my foot on the accelerator, feeling the engine roar. The tears wouldn't stop. My face burned, my mind reeling with every twisted, fractured memory of what the contagion had done. The images were as vivid as my own. It felt like I had a hand in all of it, and it corrupted my soul. The speedometer hit 80. My pulse pounded in my ears. The sun cast its first spears of light over the mountaintops. I batted at the tears, vision blurry, desperate for a clear thought. But the truth, the fucking truth, a stone lodged in my throat. I was no hero. I hadn't saved Ophelia. I looked in the mirror at my own reflection. My bloodshot eyes stared back at me. I never asked for this. Maybe I'd always wanted death. Fuck it. I jerked the wheel, threw the truck against the guardrail. Metal screamed against metal. The rail gave way. The Chevy spilled over the edge, falling through the first rays of sunlight streaming below. I began to fly. So that's our introduction to Sebastian in the present or near present. And then you tell the story through a series of flashbacks. And maybe tell us a little word about writing that. Was that early on in the process? Did you fill that in later?
It's the first thing I wrote. I wanted to start the story in media res because I wanted to catch people's attention right away, but I wanted to that was a feeling I was familiar with, the desperation and the wild desperation that comes from wanting to feel anything else. And that's where I started the story. And I wanted to do something also very crazy. So I threw my protagonist off of a cliff within the first 2 pages because I didn't just want people to keep reading, but I wanted to show them. I wanted, when they got to that point, to understand how everything else that had happened before built up to it. And there's some debate in the community, the writing community, about whether or not starting something in media res detracts from the actual incident later on. So I approached that as carefully as I could, and I was sure to make it very late in the book so that they had hopefully kind of forgot about it at that point. That's what I was hoping, that because I wanted the memory of that intensity and that emotional intensity you feel by witnessing that at the very beginning to be recalled in the rereading. But I also I knew it needed to follow something immediately compelling.
That's right. You actually replay it word for word much later in the book.
I had to edit, I edited one and I'd have to go back and edit the other. And I mean, it was just like this, oh my God, it's got to be perfect. They've got to match.
We don't want to start talking about typos on this
typos?
show. It will be another hour talking about it. But, that scene for me was very cinematic. And then I came to learn as I read on that Sebastian himself was an actor, and you chose to set his setting in the world of 1980s Hollywood, the cocaine-fueled excess of Hollywood. What was your thinking there? What was your inspiration for that? So
not only have I read some books, I've also seen some movies, and I'm very inspired by movies and storytelling in movies and cinematography. And I will be the one who will always buy the director's cut because I want to listen to the director tell me how they made the movie. I'm interested from a director's perspective. And so for me, one of the things that allowed me, and I loved adventure novels too, which are also kind of very, very plot driven, like very exciting. This kind of just a part of my storytelling style is to have this kind of this thrust into the plot or into the story, while also meandering occasionally into poetry. Like, it's very weird, but anyway, I love movies. And I want to, when I'm telling this story, I feel like if I can see it in my head and I can translate that onto page, that helps. But I also did want to go behind the scenes with this. I mean, you're kind of going behind the scenes of Sebastian's life. You don't ever get to see his movie. And you don't ever get to see him standing in front of a group of people being interviewed for his Oscar win. It's very behind the scenes. I'm just realizing, I did. It's almost like it immediately takes you behind the scenes because you're getting his inner reflections as well.
It actually doesn't give you any of the reward part. It gives you all of the dark side of it. It doesn't show you so much of the glamour and fame.
I think that's the boring part. I mean, that part's all. I didn't want to talk about that. I wanted to. Well, okay. So the thing about tragedies, and somebody said this about Hamlet, actually. So the thing about tragedies is your hero is just in the wrong story. Like, if this was a story about 1980s Hollywood and cocaine and women and fame, Sebastian would have shone as the star of that story. You know, he would have been right at home. What I did was torture him with purpose. Poor guy. So yeah, I mean, like, I thought could have that was the other thing. And again, like, I had 3 inspirations for kind of writing the story. One was to create a story that was related to my poetry in college, but also like to alleviate the heartbreak I had. One of them is the Datura's flower. And one of them was becoming associated with, or starting to orbit the Right Now community, because Jared Kaufman of Right Now does these Saturday critique shows. And he would do these very animated, dramatic interpretations of whatever excerpt you send in. And I really liked his storytelling style. I liked the way that he would do these interpretations. And I remember him saying something about him being from San Francisco. And I was like, well, great. I'll just make this guy. I love Hollywood. I love movies. I can't actually go there and create movies right now, but I can take this guy and put him there and we can see what happens. And now I've got the inspiration for it. And if he ever wants to do the audiobook, maybe he'll read the audiobook for me. He's already got the accent for it. So yeah, I mean, it was a matter of like me loving movies and me being inspired by a synchronicity and just kind of taking the reins with it. And I don't know anything about Hollywood. I've never been there. It required a bit of research, but I knew movies, I knew camp, and I knew the 80s did both really, really well or poorly, depending on who you asked. So I wanted to lean into that whole 70s Westerns. Is something that I came to very late in life, but I really appreciated, like Lonesome Dove. So I was inspired by like the 70s Western because that's where he gets his Oscar and everything. And also being in Kansas, and like you just can't escape Westerns. Like it's just part of the cowboy culture, is part of a way of life out here. Mm-hmm. But also like, I don't know what it was. The 80s just seemed to fit him. Like it seemed to suit a story where excess and addiction was so obvious.
Yeah. I felt Once Upon a Time in Hollywood vibes from your description of the 70s and 80s. So I know it's your story takes place a little later, but still that sort of almost like a colorized view of what was going on in Hollywood at the time. And it really comes through well in the book. Okay. I want to talk about Ophelia, the other main character, in a second. But first, you mentioned Jared Kaufman, and I'd be remiss if I didn't put a plug into aspiring writers who watch this video. He's an excellent editor and a true pleasure to work with. I think, Penelope, you would say the same.
Absolutely. He edited Datura's Requiem. He's editing The Love Spell Murders right now. He does amazing work. He has one of the difficulties for my writing is that it's like, as you pointed out, it's very lyrical and poetic. And he has the utmost respect for me as a poet and my style. So absolutely, I've enjoyed working with him.
I've sent him a few of my short stories, and I'm really happy with the collaboration so far. So for those of you out there, I'm sure if you track through Penelope's social media and mine, you'll find links and references to Jared. You probably got a connection to Right Now on your page, Penelope, that people can talk about. Ophelia. So she is, in a way, drawn from some of your experiences, and yet we don't get to see her except through Sebastian's visions for quite a bit of that was deliberate. So talk a little bit about how you developed that character and how you chose to incorporate her into the book.
Well, I wanted to figure out, because I knew I wanted to, I knew there had to be some sort of impulse to pull him out of what he was doing, or some sort of reason to pull himself out of what he was doing. And so Ophelia, I wasn't sure for a while if she was just a hallucination. Sebastian wasn't sure if she was just a hallucination he was having because of all the partying he was doing, or if she was a real person. And you'll see this technique comes up a couple times in Datura's where I don't necessarily distinguish between what is real and what isn't, because they say that, for example, fiction is the lie that tells the truth. And I think that Ophelia, in a way, if she was a hallucination, was a way of Sebastian connecting to something sensitive and vulnerable in himself that needed protecting. The contagion, in a different way, is an emanation of his addiction and his feeling pulled into the shadows and grasped and kept there. So at the beginning of the book, I don't want it to be certain if these things are real or not, but
I enjoyed that about it, by the way, because they don't, in a way, they don't need to be for
mm-hmm,
the impact of the story to be felt just as much.
mm-hmm.
I would love to read a passage I marked with the introduction of Ophelia into Sebastian's mind. It's short, and then I'd love to also read a short introduction of the contagion with Sebastian, if that's all right with you. I think your readers would love to hear these excerpts.
Absolutely. I'm going to remove myself from the screen so I'm not sitting here going, oh wow, that was amazing.
I don't know if I feel the same way about self-promotion. It's one of the more awkward feelings. So creating is fun, but talking about your own work is a bit uncomfortable.
It's a little bit, I mean, like, I don't necessarily, but like, I don't want to be like, oh damn, that was good. When it's my writing, like a little humility goes a long way, Penelope, right? So I'm just gonna.
Okay, well, I'll read these two short passages, and then we'll come back and listen to what you have to say about them.
All right, definitely.
Chapter 4, Sebastian, Autumn 1978. Give me that man that is not passion's slave. Hamlet, Act 3, Scene 2. Autumn never truly arrives in California. The October air doesn't bite the way it should, and the trees don't surrender to that familiar blaze of color. But even without the season, you can feel it, the shift. The nights stretch a little longer, and there's something lurking just beneath the surface. The ground seems to hum with an old, quiet energy, like the dead are stirring in their graves, as if the earth remembers what autumn is supposed to feel like, and in its confusion, it lets the past seep up through the cracks. Death never forgets its season. It's not just whispers of the past drifting up from the graves. It's the weight of our own dead deeds, the things we thought we'd buried but still haunt us. The dead, whether people or moments, call out. They urge us to let go of the past, to break the cycles we've been spinning in. I didn't know Ophelia was a living person then. To me, she was just a ghost tangled up in the drug-addled mess of my mind. Even as a phantom, she pressed in on me like the dead often do, demanding I reckon with the darkness that had begun to circle me. So that's something actually Penelope was just talking about, was this impetus for change in Sebastian's life. This is when Sebastian first sees or experiences the contagion. As Cameron turned the corner into the street, something stirred beside a dumpster in the alley. The shadows deepened unnaturally, twisting together until they formed a shape, dark, almost human. He watched me, cold and amused. A distant laugh came from his direction. In the matter of a blink, I felt his breath, hot as the fires of hell, on my neck. Hell? A low, twisted chuckle ensued. Hell itself breathes out, contagion to this world, he whispered. And while his breath was stagnant and hot, his words were cold as they curled around my heart. Fingers ran down the raw nerves of my spine, each touch sending an electric jolt through me, conjuring the memory of each sin I'd committed, as if they'd been etched there in braille, waiting for something to read them. It wasn't just reading, it was feeding. With every pass, I could feel him savoring the dark parts of me, devouring my sins, my shame, the things I'd buried so deep I almost forgot they were there. And with each piece of myself it consumed, I felt my knees giving. I was slipping, teetering on insanity, the edges of my mind fraying as the creature of shadows pressed me closer to a breaking point. I could feel the pull, an invitation to give in, to let the madness take me. Before I could fill my lungs with air to scream, he vanished. I took a deep breath and exhaled slowly. A wave of dizziness hit me and I leaned over, hands on my shivering knees, staring at a small puddle in the alley that reflected no stars on its iridescent surface. My mind buzzed, the air feeling too thick, too close. The shadow, who I called the contagion, had scraped my sins from my memories, leaving me feeling sick and exposed, like I'd been hollowed out and left behind. I wasn't the only one he haunted, though. I didn't know it then. Ophelia, she had felt him too. She knew the weight, those cold fingers that dug into the soul and left you hollow. But for her, it wasn't the things she had done that he savored. It was the things done to her. There. So there's a lot packed in those two readings, and that's kind of where we get introduced to Sebastian's visions of Ophelia and his awareness of the contagion. So maybe share a little bit about your choices there and why you chose to introduce them in that way.
I wanted to introduce the contagion at a time like that was very tense already, because I felt like the contagion would be attracted to that, and the relationship that he has with his director, which is acted upon right before that scene.
Yes, in the alley.
In the alley. I'll be as forthcoming as I'm able, but Sebastian's has you find out very early on that his father has hit him and his mother, and he has an anger that he recognizes about himself, but he doesn't want it, and he doesn't want it to take over, but he can experience that anger, and in fact Cameron encourages that anger through their sexual relationship. So there's that scene. And then I figured, and Cameron walks away whistling because he got exactly what he wanted. But I think Sebastian is haunted by the experience. Not only does he want the attention that Cameron gives him, but he doesn't want to do it in such a way that is so violent. And the contagion would rather push him into the violence, and his own darkness would rather pull him into the violence. So it's at that point, I think that he's very vulnerable, in a very vulnerable position, having acted on his more terrible impulses. And then in that guilt that comes afterwards from doing something that you know is wrong, and you do it anyway because you liked it, or because it's habit, or for whatever reason. And that's the crack in the psyche that allows the darkness in. So that's when the contagion comes in. That same crack, metaphorically, is related to the autumn. I was born the day after Halloween. I'm a little spook baby. So the dancing between the living and the dead is kind of, as I love contrasts, I love paradoxes, I love the idea of dead and not dead, alive and not alive. Like, they're all just kind of spectrums in a sense. And so that crack in the psyche, in this story about, and that was just kind of a detour into poetry as well, because I really like talking about autumn, and I wanted to talk about autumn. I experience autumns in Kansas. California doesn't get that. I wanted to explore how autumn would occur despite California's best intentions and the sunny, warm temperatures' best intentions. And
well, if I can say, Penelope, one of the reasons I chose that passage was because I love that description of autumn in California as well. It is poetic, and it does economically convey a vibe or a feeling, which I thought was just so well written. So
thank you.
Part of my reason for choosing that.
I thought that was one of the more pretty passages, but also it talks about again that crack in the season, that crack between warmth and cold, that crack between life and death, and that crack between present and past. All of those things have a barrier in between them, and the more that you feel conflicted with something, I think that's when you're opening yourself up to influence. So both of those scenes have that relationship where there's a pull between two polarities almost, which is a good catalyst for change if you want to do something assertive and put yourself through that, or it's a good catalyst to be influenced by something else, and in which case Sebastian had attracted something very dark to him. So
you mentioned how Oh, I've got an echo now. Some reason. Okay, you mentioned again. This was a bit of a therapeutic exercise for you, and these characters are so personal. Have you found it difficult after you sort of committed it to paper to leave them be, or has there been a temptation to revisit these characters in any way once you got through the final editing process?
God, I kind of want to. Honestly, I do feel like I want to. I think that once you put something into the world, I think that as an artist, nothing is I don't know what the quote is, but no art is finished, only abandoned. So,
Yeah.
and as a writer, once you publish what you've written, I feel very much that at that point, like you will, even if it could be done better, your readers will find it and love it in the form that they find it in. And any sort of revisions you do later on will dispel that mythology or that spellcraft that you've created. Do I want to go back and explore the characters? Like, I would love to, yeah, absolutely. I would love to go back and show, Sebastian's movies, and I would like to talk more about his relationship with his parents. And I'd really like to I almost would like to spend more time with this story, but for me, that tying it to poetry and those the passages that had to be flourishing and ephemeral, the form itself, I'm very interested in how ideas turn into form in the world. I think form follows function, and for the purposes of a debut novel, for the purposes of getting the story on paper before I lose my nerve, and for the purposes of making it poetic, I think that the copy that you have in your hands, which you purchased before the ink was even dry on the printing, that is the first copy of Datura's Requiem. And I think that it's perfect the way it is. Not perfect in the in Plato's theory of forms, where there's the perfect chair out there, the perfect Datura's Requiem, but I think for all of the elements to coalesce around it, they did so making perfect sense, I guess, or being perfected in their creation. That's flawed, but
and quoting Plato's a good example, because Plato's really wrong in the notion of perfect form of things.
I would agree with that.
The way the world works. So everything is evolving and organic. And I think as you change as a writer, if you were to write this 10 years from now, it would be informed by your life in those 10 years between. You couldn't write the same book with the same feeling. It's not possible.
Absolutely not. No, it's an artifact of the past, but it's an artifact of who I was when I decided to be a writer and decided to actually publish my writing. And I could not recreate that in any other way unless I wanted to hop in my time machine and skip around a few timelines where I hadn't gotten my act together yet. And maybe then I could do it differently, but otherwise it would just be a disservice to anybody who read it, because I don't like remakes. I think they're lazy, and I also think that even if the story was made with, we've come such a long way with the way that we put things together. But movies, for example, and CGI, and that storytelling from a kind of in the digital age, and they want to go back and remake all of these things, and I'm like, give me the animatronic nightmare, give me the terrible claymation mask, give me, there's just a sense of artistry with that, and a sense of human touch, human beings created. It's not like a digital dream that you input the information into a program for you. It's got this very human touch to it, and Datura's has that, I think. And I could go back, and 10 years from now, probably a lots of time maybe and lots of money to sit around and not do anything but write, and I could sit down and try to write it again, and it would just not be the same story because it's not who I am right now. So I think I'm going to leave it alone. I hope, maybe not.
Well, we should talk a little bit about Love Spell as well, because that's and I've read the first book of that, and it's very different in a way. I mean, it's sort of
You want to talk about
natural, and it's a murder mystery in a way. Do you want to say a few words about that and let the readers know what they should expect coming out with Love Spell?
Don't expect anything with Love Spell because I'm going to turn it on its head within a chapter. Genre is a palette. Genre is a palette. So I'm pan literary. I'll read anything. And I'm also somewhat well versed in several different forms of writing and storytelling. And I know I have a vocabulary that I can use to create characters of different backgrounds or different, ways of thinking or just shifting perspectives. I feel like I've spent my whole life trying to figure out how to be a shapeshifter, and it really put that to work for the Love Spell Murders. It starts out as it was intended and inspired by being a murder mystery.
It's got a crime noir, like a noir. It's got that sort of classic noir feeling to it for me, almost like out of the 40s or 50s. I mean, it doesn't take place in that time frame, but it kind of harkens back to those days of the sensationalism of the tabloids and the gumshoe detectives and all of that. Was that part of the inspiration for it?
Oh, absolutely. Actually, so I wrote Love Spell Murders, drafted it before I did Datura's Requiem, and I really wanted to set it in Hollywood. And I really didn't feel like I knew enough about Hollywood to set an entire story there. So, but I remembered that Manhattan, Kansas, home of K-State Wildcats, has the letters on the hill that spell out Manhattan, like the Hollywood sign.
Mm-hmm.
It's a very, very low budget reproduction, but it had the same noir feel to it. I lived in Manhattan briefly when I went to college there. The first and third times I went to college, attempted college. And I knew Kansas, and I know Kansans. So it was some of the advice that I'd gotten, not intentionally, but I just picked up by listening to things like I do. It was just like, sometimes the advice arrives at the right time. So somebody else was talking about like writing what you know. And I was like, well, I know Kansas. So I decided to put the story there. But I still got to write Hollywood because I did Datura's Requiem next. But it had that connection between the crime noir 40s detective story by virtue of having the same sort of sign. So it was like, well, I can just use the sign and, well, I'll stage the first murder there.
Yeah.
And so I mean, but it's very much like I spent the first 4 chapters introducing all of the characters and getting into each of their heads, and they all wanted very different introductions of each other. So
for readers who like books where you get a lot of points of view or perspectives, I definitely think they'll enjoy Love Spell because you get in the heads of at least, I want to say 5 main characters in the story, and they're all very different and very interesting in their own right. So if you like a story, you're going to love this.
Yeah, and I think that Datura's Requiem is my gatekeeper. If you don't like Datura's Requiem, don't bother with anything else I've written. But if you can hang with it, then check out the next crazy thing I'm doing for sure. It's still got poetry to it. It's still got it was my I got to be very cinematic and chaotic with it, and the genre blending kind of starts out not so obvious, but by the time you get to the end, I don't know, I'll have to take account of how many genres are in it, but it'll probably be an exercise in futility because I'm going to say like most ultimately it's a romance. That makes no sense if you've only read the first half of the book, maybe. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Anyway, I'm excited about it. I love that story so much. I can't wait to get it.
I just finished the first mini book, I guess, about 80 pages of 7, and really enjoyed it. So I'm looking forward to the next installment. Speaking of poetry,
yes,
I don't want to let your viewers off the hook without hearing a beautiful poem that was incorporated into Datura's, and it's one of the last readings that I had flagged, although like I said at the start, I could just randomly flip to a page and enjoy hearing what I read.
Absolutely.
So I'd like to read the poem Cross that you wrote, which is Ophelia's, I guess, and from her perspective, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So Ophelia, spring 1988. Go to thy deathbed, he will never come again. Hamlet, Act 4, Scene 5. Cross. I bear the weight of my father's judgment like a cross. It is heavy and I stumble often. I complain about it to him, but he doesn't care. The slapdash carpenter prefers to ignore the wood he strapped to my back when I was 2. Once twigs, now a crucifix of railroad ties. He doesn't see the scar from the nail askew that digs into my ribs. No one sees the blood until it splats against the kitchen floor. Clean up that mess. He sneers at the hunchback, but not the why. The why buckled under the weight, unaware, like his parents and their parents before them. Stand up straight. I complain, and he presses his hand into a well-worn groove in the wood to prove some point I've never understood. I bear the weight of my father's judgment like a cross, so someone else doesn't have to. I won't always carry it. Someday, and someday soon, when I am ready to do my part to mend the human race, I will find one of Chiron's sun-soaked meadows. I will kerplunk that heavy-ass burden into the soft, forgiving grass. I will learn to walk tall again. That cross will rot to pieces under every new crop of summer wildflowers until nobody who wanders by will recognize a cross ended there. So we get that beautiful piece of poetry right in the middle of Datura's. It also feels personal like the rest of the work. Is there anything you'd like to share about was that something that came to you well before the rest of the story itself, or did you think I want to put a poem here and write it for a purpose? How did you blend that in?
All of the poems I had written previously, I actually ended up just curating the ones that I ended up adding to it. So those were all from my former life. In a sense, they are all Ophelia's poetry, if Ophelia and I share any likenesses. They were written outside of Datura's Requiem. So they have kind of otherness and an intimacy outside of the story itself, which I wanted to bring her into the story, and I knew that I would always want her just for a while anyway. And you start to see after he realizes that Ophelia is a real person, chapters start with one of her poems after that, which is meant to be her poetry book. Just the poems, though, and I wanted to see how readers would perceive a character that was so integral to the plot of the story, but only came in glimmers and glimpses, and then in her own words, but in poetry, and what kind of impressive, like almost like, I don't want to talk about the ending, but like if there was only a recognition life without ever having met her, what would be the artifacts that people would find, and what would that say about her, I guess, is kind of, so I never wanted to really present her too obviously in the story, and I think that in a way that lack of obviousness, whether it's I think that that's part of the White Knight not doing his duty, is because, well, maybe it's because she's never quite solid in his life. And I think that if somebody, even if you're living with them, isn't quite solid or isn't quite, part of the main storyline, then you're always going to be a bit oblivious to them. Mm-hmm. And it makes it convenient for him to, his destiny is to do something about the visions he's having with Ophelia. He's, for whatever reason, channeling these visions, or his mind is creating these hallucinations to have him do something either with his own addictions and his own problems, or to help somebody else, and he keeps distracting himself. I mean, that's the tragedy of the story, is he keeps distracting himself. So I mean, guess going back to this is where I really started to sympathize with Sebastian and with partners, my partners, who I felt were not present in the relationship. They had their own shit going on. Everybody's got their own shit going on. And I was able to kind of, I mean, I created that story, but I think that everybody's story can probably resonate a little bit with Sebastian, and not really feeling like not doing the thing that you want to do, and, you know, doing the other fun thing, or the other, like, you know, distracting thing, or the other, because you just don't think you're worthy of doing the thing that you're supposed to be doing, the hero. Like, Sebastian always played the villain in his stories, and he always saw himself as the villain. He never saw himself as the hero, even though he was being tasked with that. And
yeah, you certainly pick up a very unhappy vibe from him in the life that he's living, even though he's, as you said, won an Oscar at, I think, the age of 17, and really had a successful, initially at least, movie career in Hollywood, where that would be, you know, a huge success for anyone. But we just see kind of the darker side of his personality, and his doubt and his self-loathing, in fact, comes as well very clearly.
Yeah, it's not fun. It's not, I mean, I get fun with like some of the chaoticness of it. And there's a scene later on when he kind of gets off his ass for a second, and he lands in what I wanted to call the prototypical town inspired by like Twin Peaks and the X-Files, like that early 90s. And of course it's the early 90s as well, 89, 91. I wanted to show, I just wanted to take a quick detour into something happier, because his life had been so stinking terrible up to that point. And it just, it didn't feel right. Because so my influence for that was actually an episode of the X-Files, where it called Field Trip, where there's this mushroom that causes people to hallucinate while it slowly digests them. And so the hallucination is they get everything they want, right? And I think that Mulder and Scully go out there to investigate a murder, and then, of course, the hallucinatory mushroom, you know, gets them, and they sink into the bog, and they're having, and it shows their visions that they're having, the hallucinations that they're having. And of course, Mulder is, I can't remember which one does which. I'm assuming that Scully is skeptical about what's going on, but Mulder's the hero, so he probably figures it out first. But anyway, they figure out you can't get everything you want. Yeah, that was it, because like Scully was like, Mulder showed up with an alien and was like, look at this, Scully, like an alien. It's all real. I have proof right here. And she's like, that can't be right. You know, like there's getting what you want. So that scene for Sebastian, that chapter, when he's getting what he wants, it's not what he really wants, because he's getting everything he thinks he wants, and he's still not doing the thing that he's supposed to be doing. And I think that it's a very noble distraction. When you've finally gotten over the drugs and you put yourself into a life that you've created, but unfortunately there's this whole destiny bitch that you still have to deal with. And I think that a lot of us do. I think that the story, among other things, is about distracting ourselves from whatever we really, really want to happen, and in Sebastian's case, which is just to heal. Like it's a redemptive healing thing for him. So
yeah, well, it's a fantastic read. As I said, I really enjoyed it. I'm going to put it up here again for your, and amazingly, you're offering it as a free gift to your future fans, and they will become fans once they read it, so they can find a link to it on your social media, right?
You can find it. I talk pretty relentlessly about it right now, because I just published it in October. My website, which is penelopehartley.com, has a page dedicated to Datura's Requiem, which needs to be updated. And also, if you're a subscriber to my newsletter, or if you want to be a subscriber to my newsletter, find the link for downloading Datura's Requiem. And you can sign up with your email and sign up to receive email notifications, my newsletter, but you also get to download Datura's Requiem. That was one of the things that I felt was very important for Datura's Requiem, was to have it be free, to have give people the opportunity to read my work, to be touched by it, because it's probably the most shamanic, most healing, most like spiritual thing that I've done. And I don't want to prevent people from having access to that if they want it. I also don't want to prevent people from having access to a story that they would like. Like I said, it's very much like it's this twofold, like, yes, I want to talk about healing and redemptions and you know, being spiritually like on point and being tight with like the other side, but I also want to write about exploding T-Rexes on occasion. So like, yeah, it's got both of
There
those.
is comic relief in the book for those that
No, I can't help. You know how many jokes they made me write out of my thesis for my history paper? It was 7. They're like, you can't put jokes in this. So I think I'm a bit funny. And I one of my defenses is to poke fun at things, or at least if your life is failing, make it fail extravagantly, which it does for Sebastian at the end of his movie career. Yeah. So, but yeah, like, absolutely, it's free, and it's also if it's free and you like it, be sure to sign up for the newsletter, and you'll get more of me in your inbox, and you'll get to learn about the Love Spell murders and these 7 books to the end of the world that I have planned.
Well, as a fan and a reader, I can say I don't think I found a dull sentence in your book, which is which means economical in a way. It's not actually a long book by page count. It's a novella, as you described it, I think about 135 pages, and well worth your time. Is there any other advice you would offer to aspiring writers or folks trying to publish their first work? It's not an easy journey, as you and I both know, in our different aspects, but
there's a lot of restraints that you have when you're publishing your first book. One of the things that I decided that I wanted to do was not publish it on Amazon. The other thing I decided I wanted to do was that I actually wanted to have hard copies of it. So I did, because I wanted it to be manifest in the world. So I did a print run of signed first editions, which I keep around for people who are like fans of the free reading. If you really liked it, you can go buy a signed first edition. It's in my store. But I just wanted to have that book on my shelf. So it depends on what you intend with yourself as a in terms of your career, but also like as a writer. So if you're, you know what, I hear somebody. I think she might have a message for us, because I recently got some advice about Datura's Requiem, which hurt my poor little poet's feelings just a little bit. But as you know, Miss Mirabelle has all kinds of catty wisdom for us, and here she is speaking to that point.
Mirabelle, you're not going to believe this one. Someone told me today that instead of having Datura's Requiem professionally printed, I should have just slapped it together with a stapler and called it a day. A stapler. Can you imagine?
A stapler? A stapler? For your blood, sweat, and metaphorical ink? The absolute audacity of some people. My tail is twitching just thinking about it. You know what that means, don't you?
That you're about to dispense a bit of snarky wisdom?
Correct. Listen carefully, Dreamweaver. There are people in this world who will only see the surface of your work. They'll look at your art, your very soul, and reduce it to paper and binding, like it's nothing more than receipts from the grocery store.
Yeah, it did sting a bit.
Of course it stings. But you, my lovely, are not creating for the ones who think your work belongs in a bargain bin. You're creating for the ones who hold your book in trembling hands, cherishing every page like a talisman. The ones who'll tuck it beneath their pillows at night to catch their very dreams.
That's very poetic, Mirabelle.
It's truth. Let me ask you this. Did Da Vinci slap the Mona Lisa into a dollar store frame?
Well, no.
Exactly. And would you hand a crown jewel to someone and say, here, keep this in your sock drawer?
I think I see where you're going with this.
Your book deserves reverence. Binding it professionally, adorning it with care, is not indulgence. It's honoring what you've created. Every stitch in the binding, every paper choice tells your audience, this story is worth your time. It's worth mine. It's worth everything.
But what if they're right? What if I'm wasting my money?
A stapler is for tax returns, not dreams. Let me be clear. You are not wasting your money. You are investing in your magic. And if they don't get it, well, let them staple their own mediocre thoughts together. Meanwhile, you'll be holding a masterpiece.
We have Miss Maribel's advice to anybody who wants to publish their first book, and to the haters and the criticism which might bring you down. So my advice to anybody who wants to publish their book is be very honest with where you're at in terms of your skill as a writer. Everybody who yes, okay, Maribel mentioned Tiara. I love that cat. ML, thank you guys so much. Maribel loves you too, and she'll be back next week for more catty wisdom. So my advice to anybody is to be very honest with yourself about where you're at in your skills. I would not try to publish until you're confident enough in your writing skill that there are certain expectations with a published book, that a clarity of text. There's a clarity of storytelling, and also that it accomplishes what you intend to do with the story. So my advice is to work with an editor, because if you're writing by yourself and you're not involved in a lot of writing groups, or you don't have a lot of feedback for your writing, then getting an editor will help you determine where you are at as a storyteller, and also what improvements that you need to make, because everybody can improve. I'm not where I want to be as a writer. I still have things that I want to try, things that I want to experiment with. Writing every day is a fantastic process if you want to be a writer full time. Also, because of the way that publishing works, you have to decide whether or not you want to be a independently published, or if you want to query. And if you want to independently publish, you definitely need to check out branding and marketing, and getting yourself out on social media as well, and garnering a following for what you're writing. So, but my advice is, if you feel like you want to write, then write. Hello, Pat, and welcome back. My Ophelia was writing, I think. If Sebastian resonated with me, which he did on several different levels, but one of them is distracting yourself from what you really want to do, until you figure out that you just have to do the damn thing. And for me, doing the damn thing was writing. I spent a lot of time gathering up experiences for writing, but and I always wrote poetry, but it wasn't until the last few years, and I'm in my 40s, and it wasn't until the last few years that I sat down and was like, I'm not going to get anywhere else in my life until I start being a writer. And that included sucking it up and becoming a marketer and a self-promoter, as well as finding an editor. I have a pretty strong background in art, so experimenting with artistic representations in marketing has been a fun part of my journey. But yeah, if you have that call, if you have that insistent call within you, explore it. There are tons of resources online. One of the things that they always told me in grad school was, you don't have to get a degree in writing to be a writer. It's just faster, because you have all of people fingertips, and we've got YouTube University, you've got writing communities like Right Now, which is exceptional for new writers. Find people online who write, and start sharing your stories and see what happens with it. And you know what? Don't let people get you down about it.
And stay away from the scammers too, because they come around like vultures as soon as you say something about writing a book. Penelope, I just want to kind of seize on one of the things you mentioned that's true for me as well. And it's sort of about the need to find a place where you can write. And so for me, I have places I can go to write where I'm not distracted by everyday life, because everyday life will always distract you from it's a bit like Sebastian, always finding a distraction, right?
Yeah.
And so I definitely believe in that, but always be open to inspiration. And I'm sure you recognize that inspirations come at unexpected times, and the trick is to recognize them for what they are when you see them.
I think that for me, it's just something that draws my attention in a little bit more than background noise. Always for me signals something that I should be listening to, something important. It doesn't matter how random it is at the time. Most of the time it seems to become relevant later. And I don't know if that's, we haven't really dived too much into the scientific / mystical reality that we experience as human beings. But I do feel like that, like if there are stars whispering to me, which I believe there are, I think that one of my gifts as a star seeker is to take inspiration from, I sometimes say that the world is my tarot deck. And I wrote, the Horse Thief's Grimoire was based mostly on writing prompts I found on my walks or in my personal life or while cruising through the internet. I once wrote an entire tarot deck, well, not an entire tarot deck, but the major arcana, based on, I told the universe I was going to write a tarot deck based on memes, and every day I would look for a meme that associated with one of the major arcana cards, and the universe provided. Like it showed up for, I think that, and it doesn't necessarily need to be like a mystical experience. I think that there are a lot of practical explanations for these kind of things. I think that life is mysterious too, though, but we also have what I think is really interesting. I'm just going to dip my toe into this right quick, but quantum, the quantum nature, the quantum entanglement and the quantum nature of reality. I think that my interest in the paradox culminates in the idea that the paradox isn't different. The two oppositions are the same. And I think that you can either be the reader of your life, or I think that you can be a writer. I think that you can, and I mean that very practically, and I mean that very metaphorically as well. I feel like if you set a particular intention with something, that you're going to, your subconscious mind is going to look for opportunities to pursue that intention. In a mystical sense, if you set your intentions with something and you let the universe know, the universe may put things in your obstacle. Whether or not you're the observer or the observed depends on whether or not you're being assertive or receptive in your life.
And for those of you that haven't been introduced to your work yet, you sign off as Penelope Hartley, but below that it's 23, the writer. So do I take that?
The writer.
You've chosen to be the writer, not the reader.
I've chosen, well, so the major arcana in the tarot has 22 cards, starting with the Fool at 0, which it represents all possibilities, and ending with 21, the World. So 23, the writer, is the 23rd card in the major arcana. It's a free card. I think there's a few people, like some people call Robert Anton Wilson, who was a chaos magician in the 70s who wrote a lot of books. The 23 is also associated with chaos. But yeah, so for me, like to answer your question, I think that when I decided on that for my my brand, it was a big, bold move to not only associate myself with the 23rd archetype of the tarot, but also to claim it for writers and writing. But I did. And yeah, I think that I think that you can be an observer in your life. And I think that you can let other people write the story. And you write the story that way too, though, because we have a choice in everything that we do. If you really, really lean into the idea that you will always have a choice to either continue on the path that you're on or to move off of that path into something else. We always have a choice with how we react to situations. And you can tell because some people have different reactions to the same situation. Some people have different perspectives on the same situation. Yeah. And healing from trauma becomes associating reality with itself and not with the past that you've experienced. So I think that it's difficult, and I don't want to diminish anybody's experience who hasn't had that, because I felt very much tossed on the waves of my own experiences. Datura's Requiem is proof of that. However, I felt like once I stepped into a role of more of an active choice taking and changing my choices so that they had different outcomes, that's when things started to align for me. So, yeah.
And it's interesting you talk about, observation versus, writing. I think for writers out there, and I'm an amateur one as well, but I think a curious mind and an observational nature is essential. And I thought about it when you used your example of talking about Wish You Were Here by Pink Floyd, right?
Mm-hmm.
A writer or an artist notices and zooms in on that little 5-second intro.
Mm-hmm.
Goes, that's interesting, right?
Mm-hmm.
And it's like in Datura's too, the things you choose, because you can't present everything in three-dimensional reality. There's too many details. So the writer has to choose, what am I going to zoom in on for the reader that's going to highlight something unique to them or come at it from a different angle? And I love the scene that I won't read, but in the trailer, I forget who he was with, Sebastian, has just had a hookup in his trailer on the lot.
She is Margar over it.
Yeah. He throws her that wet cloth to clean herself after, and she chunks it against the window.
Yeah, she chunks it against the window. And
it's just noticing the drops of water. I mean, it's such a detail to zoom in on. And you could have done the scene without it, but I think what makes it interesting is sort of makes it real for people when you pick any detail about a scene and really dig into it a little bit for your reader, right?
That was some advice I got in grad school, was the more specific, the more mysterious. And somebody else had said something when they were drawing, that the more detail you put into a drawing of a face, for example, the more interesting it becomes. So I try to pick out, offhand details in the prose or something unexpected, to ignite a sense of differentness. I think that it's always injecting a freshness into it. And life is full of these weird little like textures and details. And I think that I love that about life and about books, especially if a writer is good at talking about different odd textures of reality. So, but that is very good advice. Like, absolutely. Being a good observer and being able to put yourself into the story as somebody who's observed something in great detail and being able to write about that in detail is it'll help you develop your style if you're not sure what your style is. But it also help you be a good storyteller because life is in the details, right?
Yes, so. That's right. And prompts are everywhere in life. I mean, there's you've some people use tarot cards, and maybe you should share a little more about your interest in tarot, but other people publish books that say, here's 100 prompts if you want to write a story. But prompts exist in the world around us at all times. And you and I have talked, and we're not here to talk about my work, but one that stands out to me is seeing those feet sitting out of a hotel room when I was away in California. And it's like, you don't see that every day.
No.
There has to be a story in that. And that's the mind of the writer. It's not like, I'm going to sit down at 8 a.m. and now I'm going to see what ideas come to me, right? So you've talked about cutting the lawn or being outside doing something, and all of a sudden inspiration strikes. And you just have to make sure you're open to it when it comes.
That was actually something Bob Dylan said. He said it's not his place to demand that art comes to him. It's his place to sit back and wonder what the muse has to say. I'm paraphrasing, but like that was one of the things that he talked about in terms of songwriting, was to not demand inspiration from the world around you, but to kick back and see where it happens. And yeah, like inspiration is definitely all around you. Like I said, I call it the world is my tarot deck. Like I'm always seeing something that is relevant to my work or relevant to my life that can be used. I think that people worry too much about how they're going to put things together. I say put them together as you find them, and then that's what the editing process is for stitching that all together. I've had really good luck with that. That might not be everybody's cup of tea, but I've had really good luck with taking a bunch of different pieces and stitching to them together, and it's a lot easier than you think if you practice it a little bit. So but we have, let's see here, we've got about 15 minutes left. I did put out to the community or to the viewers to see if anybody had any questions for us, and you got one, Pat. For you. My story is close to Pat since I am also retired and did not publish my first story until this year. How do you deal with the marketing issues as a new author? Which is a really good question for anybody who's just starting out and wants to publish.
Yeah, it's hard. Marketing is hard. First of all, there's, ignore most of what comes into your Instagram or Facebook or whatever. So, I mean, you need to be on social media, and it's great to connect with groups where you can see real people and they're not bots out there to scam you. And so, like Jared Kaufman's Right Now community is a great supportive community. Penelope starting her podcast. I'm not a podcaster, and maybe we're from the same generation. We're maybe slightly older tech folks. My wife's been instrumental in helping with some of the promotion. I say if it wasn't for her, my first book, Firehorse, would be a Word document on my laptop still. But Penelope talked about creative control, and I think it's important to get your own ISBN number and control your work product yourself is one thing. For me, I wrote a story that took place in Michigan, and so I'm choosing more of a groundswell. I mean, people expect to go sell 10,000 copies. I just don't. That's not actually what's happening in the world of publishing right now. Things are getting smaller quantity and more variety rather than mega sellers, unless you've got a traditional publisher. And so book clubs, indie bookstores, networks like this where you can find like-minded folks that appreciate your work and they can recommend it to 5 people in that viral way is what I feel gets the most bang for the buck. I don't know, Penelope, you must have your own thoughts on this.
I haven't done that much marketing. I was of the mind that I would get something on the showroom floor, and then if I did something remarkable that went viral, I would at least have something there for them to get when they decided to investigate me more. I'm pushing into social media marketing. Next, I have because I find it really confusing and because I do a lot of different offerings, I decided to put each offering on a particular social media platform depending on how I wanted to put the content out there. So Datura's is deeply poetic, and it will resonate with TikTok readers who like a kind of the more intellectual, the darker sort of stories. And I also have a lot of my poetry kind of stirs in that the same shadows. I have a chapbook of poetry called Waltzing with Hermanubis, who is a god of the underworld, that I will be releasing at some point within the next couple of months. So I decided to do TikTok because of the visual storytelling. And because slideshows, it had a couple of different ways of doing things that would work. So slideshows, where you can post an excerpt and have like a sentence or two, and people will go through and read the excerpts. But I have a little bit of director in me, so I wanted to do poetry, read my poetry, and do kind of art school videos around them. So I decided that TikTok would be for my poetry and for Datura's Requiem. And then I put you have that little bio, and I put the link to the newsletter lead, which is where you can download Datura's in there. And then Instagram is going to be where I put my 7-book series. It's got big book energy, so I put big book offering on there. It's a very visual format again, so I'm working to put the Love Spell Murders in storyboard form on that. And because you can read all of the beta drafts of my story, I release a couple of chapters every week on Ream, which is kind of like Patreon for writers. I put the link to my Ream account there.
I feel like Love Spell would make a great graphic novel, by the way.
Exactly what I'm attempting to do with it. Because, yeah, I mean, it's very cinematic. It's very visual. A lot of the characters and a lot of the vibe from it can translate really well into, because but I'm using AI because I'm a one-woman band right now. So I don't necessarily, like, I call it the storyboard because it's not like the actual graphic novel or the actual animated story that I want to tell, but it's the idea of it visually. So that's what I'm working with on there, and I plan on doing that for all 7 books and releasing all 7 books to fans a bit early, and then of course releasing the main books twice a year.
Can't wait for the next one, and would love actually printed copies signed at some point. But
absolutely. I think that I'm going to do that with everything, because I didn't go through Amazon, and because I got my own ISBNs, and because I have control over my published works. Okay. I decided to keep everything in-house so I can sell exclusively on my website, which allows people not only to purchase a physical copy but also the ebook. So and that increases my profits, because Amazon isn't taking, X percentage of the sale at that point.
A big percentage, something like 70 or 80%.
It's high. It's for somebody who's starting out and doesn't have a lot of overhead to begin with. Like, I don't want to lose.
Yeah. And so I just wanted to finish one thing with ML too.
Sure.
That comes to mind. And ML, first of all, don't take a lack of responses or sales to mean the quality of the work isn't good, because unfortunately it's a difficult, crowded space, and there's some beautiful work that sits in darkness for a long time. And the second thing I would say is, and Penelope mentioned it earlier, make sure before you throw it out there, it's as free from typos as you can make it, as clear as you can make it. You've read it through multiple times. There's a process you're probably quite familiar with of using beta readers that you trust and small community to give you some honest feedback, so you can put the very best foot forward when you do cast your seeds into the wind.
Mm-hmm. And one of the best pieces of advice I ever got for writing was, don't let perfection get in the way of telling a good story. Mm-hmm. There is going to have to, I mean, obviously you want it to look pretty and be as typo free as possible. Glitches do happen, but you want it to be the exception, not the rule with your writing. And do not obsess so much on the particulars of what you're doing that you can't release it comfortably and move on to the next project. Because writing is it's not so much about like sitting there with the same book for a couple of years and like going over it. And at some point I would love to write more books like Datura's Requiem, and maybe I will move into my elder poet phase at some point where it takes me 3 years to publish a book, but that's just not the reality of publishing right now. So you have to decide where you want to balance things. Is Datura perfect? It's perfect for what it is. It's flawed in its own beautiful little ways, but I think that everything, I mean, like, and maybe this is like an argument to be made for the beauty in flaws. It's not, AI can be so perfect with the way that it does things, not in terms of like the visual aspects of it, but like in terms of how it writes things. And I think that if you move, poetry allows its own imperfections, very conscious of them, and remarks them as being part of the experience. So neither let there be too many typos, nor too much of an obsession with perfection. So that
maybe the best way to say it is, there's like a law of diminishing returns. And when you feel like you've done the best justice you can for the story, you have to do what Penelope said earlier, which I think was a Da Vinci quote even originally. It's been requoted so many times, but abandon it. You have to abandon that child to take care of other children that are clamoring to get out of your brain. So
Absolutely. You have to move forward. Art is about taking a moment and creating it, something about it, something that says something in that moment for you and in that moment for the world and your place in it. And then, creatively moving forward that as an artist, you should always be reaching for the part where you don't quite touch the bottom. I think
And I think motivation and sincerity matter a lot. If you say, I want to write a bestseller, and you don't really have anything inside that you're yearning to say, you're not going to succeed, because you're going to sit down and approach it from a technical point of view. You should be writing about things that speak to you, and you have to take a risk. It's a place of vulnerability, I would say. Penelope, wouldn't you agree? I mean, put yourself out there on paper, have everyone you know and have ever met in your life read something that could be drawing things that are so personal. It's but if you don't do that, the quality of story won't be there.
Yeah, if you don't do that, then isn't part of existence to share it and to share it with other people? And isn't there something beautiful in the act of just putting what's in your heart? Like, writing's great for really deep personal reflection too. Poetry is really good for that because it intensely focuses on one aspect and makes you circle it over and over again until you figure out what are the exact right words to describe this feeling that I'm having.
I tried oh, sorry, go ahead.
No, you never quite get there. But again, yeah, so there's just this part where I think that we go, this is done.
I tried an experiment I read about somewhere for a month, and that was to write a haiku every day about something I had seen, almost like a journal. And Penelope talked about the economy of poetry, and haikus are a perfect example because you're also forced to work within a structure. And I don't write poetry. It's not something I would ever claim to have a strength at, but that experience was a great experiment. And ML and others, it's worth trying just to get that rhythm every day. Write a haiku. Try writing a haiku every day about something that happened to you. And at the end of a month, you'll have 30 haiku that are memorable and interesting.
And you'll also have a routine. And I think that one of the most important things to establish if you want to be a writer is to establish a routine. One of the things that I really struggled with when I was writing the Horse Thief's Grimoire was writing consistently. And I decided when I finally had finished that over the course of 2.5 years, I decided I need to sit down every day and be a writer. It took me a month to write The Love Spell Murders because I got myself into a routine of writing every day. And that writing and that practice is strengthening your skill as a writer and your dedication to writing. And it's showing, there's this beautiful quote that's something like, every little thing that we do is a small spell cast for the thing that we want. And so by sitting down and writing something every day, you're casting a little bit of a spell, one element of a spell that will eventually culminate in a 60,000, 70,000 word novel.
Yeah.
So,
and ML, being retired, you would think gives you the flexibility and freedom to do some writing every day. You'd be surprised at how distracting life can be. So it will still take some discipline, and discipline and creativity feel like that they're diametrically opposed, but you do need to bring some discipline to your creativity if you want to get anything done.
Oh yeah. Alexander Pope said something beautiful about poetry that was like, he's like a rider and a horse. The rider steers the horse, but the horse is the raw natural beauty of it. And I think that creativity and discipline share a similar experience. You can make yourself be creative. Actually, what it is you discover you're actually creative. You don't need to be inspired by something necessarily. Sometimes just sitting down and writing stuff can be inspiring in itself. So we got one more question. Actually, Jared Kaufman showed up to say hi, and he had a question for both of us. Both of you have an incredible way with words in your storytelling. How do you come up with the right word choice that makes your writing so poetic? I'll let you start.
Oh God.
I know, right? Words. Oh my God, where do the words come from?
I mean, if you knew the answer to that, to write a formula for it, you could be a millionaire, right? It's
right.
You called it the muse. I recognize that comment. It's like, for first of all, you need an idea. And then when you see something that triggers that idea, it's like actually so much comes at you. It's about distilling it down for me and figuring out what to cut out rather than what to put in. My bigger problem is putting too much in, like salt in a recipe. And then it's like, whoa, got to dial this back.
Yep.
And leave something to the imagination. I don't have the poetic background that Penelope has. So often I'll find myself rereading what I've written and saying, there's got to be a better way to say that. There's got to be a better way to say that. It's not like Mozart where poetry spews immediately from your mouth and it's perfect when it comes out. Got to keep on working away at it.
I've read you, so I know that you have this amazing capability of saying something that seems very mundane, but is very poetical in its own right. Like, it's sometimes just about adding an extra word. I remember in Coronado, you were talking about the police officer, and you said something about ruining his day. Yeah. I mean, you didn't have to mention that at all. You could have just said, I was talking to a police officer about this issue. But instead, your speaker was very aware of the fact that he was ruining this guy's day. Yeah. There's 3 words that you added in there, but it gave such a depth to this scene at that point, because suddenly this poor police officer is standing there like writing this down. Oh my God. Like, this is terrible. And it's just, sometimes it's just about like imagining just a little bit deeper into the scene. I liken it to sculpting a scene and then sculpting the words. Like Stephen King was always very like, the word you're looking for is not in the thesaurus. And what he meant by that was you don't need to reach out for those extraordinary words. I like those extraordinary words, but I don't use them so often because they're like spice. They're like using too much salt. If I wrote a poem the way that, it's studded with this interesting vocabulary, it would self-emulate on its own meaning because it would be too much. And especially in prose, I had to learn to pull back on that as well. But you don't have to use the pretty poetic words. What you have to do is find the right word or the right phrase that conveys. It's about conveying meaning. It's about just hinting at something just a little bit more in your scene.
I've seen posts online where people are like, I need to say this better, and they run a thesaurus check, and none of the words work because the problem isn't the individual word. The problem is the phrase and what you're choosing to highlight. And the trick I use is I try to think of zooming in on a detail that you wouldn't normally hear about in a story or you wouldn't normally see. And Penelope, I picked this up in your work too, where you choose to zoom. The example of the cloth that I used, I thought was wonderful. Nobody writes that. That was like, that put me in the moment of that. And you don't have to describe everything. Pick one thing and describe it really well, and it conveys an entire sort of vibe. And so I think it's that choosing what to zoom in on and then zoom right in on that detail. Well, zoom in on every detail. Then you end up with people won't get to the end of the chapter kind of thing.
Well, and I could have said she was upset.
Yeah.
I could have said she was upset, but instead I had her throw that cloth at him, and I had him be so, so distant from like a relationship that she was trying to have and he wasn't, that he just like, instead of paying attention to the act, he's observing the cloth ride a snail trail down on the window and the droplets of water on it. Like he's distracting himself from whatever. It's about it that dives into, and that's what poetry is really good at, the minutia of show don't tell. Like,
well, I'm going to use an example that I already read from yours because I think it's to Jared's point, and it's sort of the description of autumn, right?
Oh yeah.
You could have just said autumn never truly arrives in California, but then you talk about how the nights stretch a little longer and there's something lurking just beneath the surface. The ground seems to hum with an old quiet energy, like the dead are stirring in their graves, as if the earth remembers what autumn is supposed to feel like. And in its confusion, it lets the past seep up through the cracks. That's poetry built into a paragraph in prose. And it conveys a feeling more than a visual for me. And I think sometimes, you're looking for a feeling rather than visual. You have to also know what you want your reader to feel and think at that point, and aim at that.
Yes, absolutely. And word choice can sculpt that. Phrasing will definitely sculpt that. It's word choice is great. Phrasing it scene, phrase, word, sculpt. I mean, there's this whole like hierarchy of how to build a vibe or build a feeling within your work. But yeah, for me, like that was the slow roll of mist out of a graveyard, was the energy that I was going for into a stream of bright sunlight. Again, I'm always looking for those contrasts between two things.
And your reader will fill in the rest when you give them those clues, right? If you overfeed them, doesn't leave room for their imagination, and it can become boring. And if you just give them enough of a clue, they'll fill the rest in. I think it's that trick of figuring out what's enough.
Yeah, I started way too poetically, and I had somebody tell me, just remind them once a page that you're a writer. So we should probably get going. I know that a lot of our audience, we've been here for 2 hours, and this has been an amazing conversation. I so enjoyed it. Thank you so much. I know that our audience is heading over to see Kaufman is doing his special show on editing today, which I think I'm a little worried about. I'm afraid that some of my not so nice.
Maybe mine will be in there. Don't worry. Maybe it'll be mine.
Right, exactly.
Thanks so much for having me on your show.
Oh, thank you so much for coming. And next time you come back, we will definitely have to have you discuss Fire Horse. So. All right. Thank you. And thank you, everybody, for showing up on this stream. I'm Penelope Hartley, and this is Pat Olney, and you have been watching Aether and Ink.